Blood Knowledge. Chapter 1. The Inheritance. The rain drummed against the villa's warped shutters like skeletal fingers tapping for entry. Giulia Ferraro stood in the doorway of her grandfather's library, clutching the brass key that had taken 3 locksmiths to duplicate. The October air carried the scent of wet stone and something else, something older, mustier, like parchment left too long in damp places. "Murda," she whispered, surveying the chaos before her. Books towered in precarious stacks, their leather spines cracked and faded. Dust motes danced in the pale afternoon light filtering through grimy windows. The room felt frozen in time, as if her grandfather had simply vanished mid-sentence, leaving his life's work to slowly decay in this forgotten corner of Florence. Giulia hadn't spoken to Nonno Alessandro in 5 years. Their last conversation had ended in shouting, her rational modern mind clashing against his rambling stories of family curses and ancient obligations. Now, at 29, drowning in dissertation debt and facing academic exile, she found herself inheriting the very obsessions she'd once dismissed. The villa itself was a burden, 3 stories of Renaissance stonework, beautiful but crumbling, nestled in the hills above Florence. The inheritance taxes alone would bankrupt her, but the will had been specific. She could sell nothing until she'd completed the work. What work, the lawyers couldn't say. The old man had left no explanation, only this key and a cryptic note: Il sangue riconosce il sangue. The blood recognizes the blood. She stepped carefully around towers of books, many in languages she couldn't identify. Latin, certainly, Greek, but others bore scripts that seemed to writhe in her peripheral vision. Her grandfather had been a collector, she knew, specializing in what he'd called lost Renaissance wisdom. Her parents had always been embarrassed by his eccentricities. In the room's center sat an enormous oak desk, its surface barely visible beneath scattered papers. Giulia approached cautiously, as if the furniture itself might collapse under scrutiny. A thin layer of dust covered everything except for one leather-bound notebook, its cover surprisingly clean. She opened it, expecting her grandfather's familiar scrawl. Instead, she found elegant Renaissance script in fading brown ink. Anno Domini, 1589. I, Alessandro Ferraro, do set down this record of my covenant with the Prince of Knowledge, that my descendants might understand the price of wisdom. Giulia's breath caught. This wasn't her grandfather's writing. This was much older. She flipped through pages of dense text, diagrams of geometric patterns, and repeated references to someone called Pimon. The name appeared dozens of times, sometimes within elaborate charts showing celestial positions, other times in what looked like ritual instructions. A loose sheet slipped from the notebook's back cover. Modern paper, her grandfather's handwriting. "Giulia, if you're reading this, then the burden passes to you. I spent 60 years trying to break what our ancestor began, but I was too weak. Perhaps you, with your education and your skepticism, can succeed where I failed. Or perhaps you'll be wise enough to embrace what I could not. The choice was always supposed to be yours. Study the notebooks first, learn what we are, then decide. The ritual room is in the basement. Follow the black stones in the wall. And remember, he's been waiting for you since before you were born." No. Giulia set the note down with trembling fingers. Academic excitement warred with a growing unease. If these were genuine Renaissance documents, they could revolutionize her dissertation, the historical value alone. But her grandfather's warning nagged at her. The man who'd collected grimoires like other people collected stamps, who'd insisted their family was bound by ancient contracts, had he actually believed this nonsense? She gathered the notebook and several loose papers, then noticed something else on the desk, a small brass bell, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. Without thinking, she picked it up. The moment her fingers touched the metal, a low ringing filled the room. Not from the bell, but from somewhere deeper in the house. She dropped it, but the sound continued for several seconds before fading to silence. In that silence, she heard something else, footsteps in the hallway above. Giulia froze. She was alone in the house. The lawyers had given her the only keys. The footsteps moved slowly, deliberately, across the ceiling. Old wood creaked under measured weight. Then they stopped directly overhead. She waited, hardly breathing, but heard nothing more. Old houses settled, she told herself. The rain, the temperature changes. Perfectly normal explanations. She gathered the notebook and papers, suddenly eager to leave the dusty library. As she reached the doorway, she glanced back one more time. The brass bell sat exactly where she'd dropped it, but now it was perfectly upright, as if carefully placed. A trick of her memory, surely. Stress and exhaustion playing games with her perception. But as she climbed the villa's main staircase, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her from the library's shadows. Something that had been waiting a very long time for her to ring that bell. Chapter 2. The first translation. Giulia's apartment near the university looked like a bomb had gone off in a research library. Books covered every surface, their pages bristling with colored tabs and handwritten notes. Empty espresso cups formed precarious towers on her desk, and she'd forgotten to eat anything but crackers in the past 2 days. The Renaissance notebook lay open before her, its secrets slowly yielding to her translation efforts. Her grandfather had been right about one thing: this was extraordinary historical material. The original Alessandro Ferraro had been connected to the Medici court, specifically to a secretive group of scholars who'd apparently practiced. What? Alchemy was the obvious answer, but the rituals described in the notebook went far beyond simple chemistry. She'd made a breakthrough that morning with the recurring name Pimon. Cross-referencing with medieval demonology texts had led her to Paimon, one of the kings of hell described in the Ars Goetia. But the Renaissance Alessandro had used a different spelling, possibly to hide his true intentions from church authorities. According to the notebook, Paimon, or Pimon, was a prince of knowledge who could grant wisdom beyond mortal comprehension. The catch, naturally, was a price service across generations, binding not just the practitioner but their bloodline. Giulia leaned back in her chair, rubbing her tired eyes. Academic fascination warred with growing unease. Her rational mind insisted this was simply historical curiosity. Renaissance people had believed in demons the way modern people believed in vitamins. But something about the clinical precision of Alessandro's writing disturbed her. This wasn't superstitious rambling. These were careful instructions, detailed observations, the work of someone who genuinely believed he was documenting real phenomena. Her phone buzzed, a text from her advisor, Dr. Ricci. Giulia, still need your chapter draft. Extension deadline is Friday. Friday. 3 days away, and she had nothing to show but months of false starts. Her dissertation on occult influences in Renaissance art had seemed brilliant in proposal form, but she'd found precious little concrete evidence to support her theories. Most Renaissance artists had been careful to hide any heterodox influences. But this notebook, this was exactly what she'd been looking for. Primary source material, written by someone who'd apparently lived these beliefs rather than simply painting allegorical representations. She picked up her phone to call Dr. Ricci, then hesitated. How could she explain finding documentation of actual demon worship in her family's history? Better to wait until she had more concrete analysis. As evening settled over Florence, Giulia returned to her translation work. The ritual instructions were becoming clearer, though some symbols remained mysterious. Alessandro had written extensive notes about preparation. Specific dates, astronomical conditions, offerings required. It read like a recipe, complete with warnings about variations that could lead to, what had he called it, unintended bindings. The original contract, according to the notebook, had been for knowledge of the future, specifically, advance warning of political changes that could affect the Medici family's fortunes. In exchange, Alessandro and his bloodline would serve as anchors for Pimon's manifestations in the mortal realm, whatever that meant. The disturbing part was what came after. Alessandro had documented his growing realization that the contract couldn't be broken, only transferred. Each generation, one family member would be chosen to serve as the primary anchor. The others would be influenced, but not fully bound. Giulia paused at a passage dated 1601. The prince grows impatient with my hesitation. He appears nightly now, no longer content to whisper from shadows. My familiar grows bold. Yesterday it spoke with my late wife's voice, promising me reunion if I will but complete the great work. I begin to understand that my death will not release me, only change the nature of my service. God forgive me, I have bound not only myself but generations yet unborn. She shivered and reached for her sweater. The apartment's heating was unreliable, but this cold seemed to come from within. Outside, the rain had started again, drumming against her windows with renewed intensity. A sound from the kitchen made her look up, just a settling noise, probably the old radiator. But it had sounded almost like footsteps? She listened carefully but heard only rain and distant traffic. Too much coffee, too little sleep. She was starting to jump at every creak and whisper. Returning to the notebook, she found a section that made her pause. It was a complete ritual, not just fragments or theoretical discussion, but detailed step-by-step instructions for initial contact with the Prince of Knowledge. The ritual was surprisingly simple, specific words spoken at midnight, a few common materials, and something called a vessel of welcome. Alessandro had included careful notes about the vessel. Apparently, it could be almost anything, but it had to be offered freely and with genuine intent. The vessel would then serve as a focus for the entity's presence, a way for it to anchor itself in the mortal realm. What caught Giulia's attention was a marginal note in her grandfather's handwriting, the brass bell, still active after 400 years. Hidden it in the library, she must choose to ring it herself. The brass bell. She'd touched it yesterday, and it had, what? Made a sound that wasn't quite right. She'd been so focused on the mysterious footsteps that she'd barely thought about it since. But now, translating Alessandro's careful descriptions, she realized what her grandfather had been trying to tell her. The bell wasn't just a historical artifact. It was the original vessel of welcome, still active, still connected to whatever pact Alessandro had made 4 centuries ago. She looked at her phone, 11:47 p.m., almost midnight. The rational part of her mind insisted this was all nonsense. Renaissance superstition, family mythology, coincidental timing. But another part, the part that had spent years studying how belief could shape reality, wondered what would happen if she simply spoke the words, just as an experiment, just to see. After all, if none of this was real, nothing would happen. And if it was real, well, she'd finally have material for her dissertation that no other scholar could possibly match. She opened the notebook to the ritual page and began to read aloud. Pimon, Prince of Knowledge, Lord of Whispers, I call to you across the veil of years. The words felt strange in her mouth, as if her tongue wasn't quite designed for their pronunciation. Giulia read slowly, carefully, determined to get the ancient invocation exactly right. If she was going to do this, and apparently she was, she might as well do it properly. I am blood of the blood that called you first. I am the daughter of daughters, the inheritor of debts unpaid. I seek knowledge beyond the scope of mortal learning, wisdom hidden from those who serve lesser masters. The apartment had grown unnaturally quiet. Even the rain seemed muted, as if the world were holding its breath. Giulia's voice sounded thin and distant in the silence. I offer myself as vessel and anchor, as my ancestor did before me. Come to me in dreams, in whispers, in the spaces between sleeping and waking. Share with me the secrets that lesser minds cannot bear, and I will serve as your faithful student. She paused. The final line required her to offer something specific, the vessel of welcome that would allow the entity to manifest. But she didn't have the brass bell. It was back at the villa, sitting on her grandfather's desk. Or was it? She turned around, and her heart nearly stopped. There, on her coffee table, sat the brass bell. Impossible. She'd left it at the villa yesterday, she was certain. Yet here it was, as if it had always been part of her apartment's furnishings. With trembling fingers, she picked it up. The metal was warm to the touch, almost body temperature. She completed the ritual. I ring the bell that has rung for 400 years. I open the door that my ancestor opened before me. Let the covenant be renewed, let the pact be fulfilled. Come to me, Pimon. Come and teach me the price of wisdom. She rang the bell. The sound that emerged was nothing like what she'd expected. Instead of a clear chime, the bell produced a deep, resonant tone that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The sound didn't fade. It built, growing richer and more complex, until Giulia could swear she heard voices hidden in its harmonics. Then, abruptly, silence. She waited, hardly breathing. Nothing happened. No dramatic manifestation, no supernatural phenomena, just her messy apartment, the rain outside, and the growing realization that she'd just performed a ritual demon summoning like some medieval peasant. Brilliant, she muttered. Absolutely brilliant academic methodology. But as she started to close the notebook, movement caught her eye. In the window's reflection, something dark had appeared behind her chair, a tall shadow that seemed to shimmer with its own depth. She spun around but found only empty space. When she looked back at the window, the reflection showed only herself, pale and wide-eyed, holding a brass bell that now felt cold as winter stone. She set the bell down and rubbed her eyes. Stress hallucination, nothing more. She'd been working too hard, sleeping too little, drinking too much coffee. Tomorrow she'd feel foolish about this whole episode. But as she prepared for bed, Giulia couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The apartment felt different, not threatening exactly, but expectant, as if it were waiting for something to begin. She dreamed of cats that night. Not ordinary cats, but sleek black creatures with eyes like molten gold and expressions of almost human intelligence. In the dream, she was back in her grandfather's villa. But the rooms were brighter, cleaner, filled with the kind of furnishings she'd seen in Renaissance paintings. A beautiful black cat sat in the library's center, watching her with profound attention. "You rang the bell," it said in a voice like silk rustling. "After so many years of waiting, you finally rang the bell." "I don't understand," Giulia heard herself reply. "You will. Knowledge comes slowly to mortals. It must, or your minds would shatter from the weight of truth. But you've begun the process. You've opened the first door." The cat began to circle her, its movements hypnotically graceful. "Your ancestor was afraid, in the end. He tried to hide from what he'd chosen, tried to pretend the contract could be ignored. But blood calls to blood, and debts demand payment. You're stronger than he was. You'll embrace what he rejected. What are you? I am your familiar, your companion, your guide, your connection to the prince who grants all knowledge. Through me, you'll learn things that will revolutionize not just your small academic career, but humanity's understanding of reality itself." The cat stopped directly in front of her, its golden eyes boring into hers. "But first, you must invite me in. The ritual opened the door, but I cannot enter your waking world until you choose to welcome me. Will you do that, Giulia Ferraro? Will you complete what your ancestor began?" She wanted to ask more questions, to understand what she was agreeing to, but the dream was already fading. The last thing she remembered was the cat's voice, now speaking in her grandfather's familiar accent. "Remember, Bambina. He's been waiting for you since before you were born." Giulia woke with a gasp, her heart racing. Pale morning sunshine streamed through her bedroom window, and for a moment the dream seemed ridiculous, just another stress-induced fantasy. Then she heard purring. She sat up slowly, afraid of what she might see. There, curled on the chair beside her bed, was the most beautiful black cat she'd ever encountered. Its fur gleamed like polished obsidian, and when it opened its eyes to look at her, she saw intelligence that was definitely not feline. "Hello, Giulia," it said in a voice like warm honey. "Shall we begin your education?" Chapter 4, The Education Begins. Giulia stared at the cat, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Talking animals belonged in fairy tales, not in her shabby Florence apartment. Yet here it sat, regarding her with an expression of patient amusement. "You're not real," she whispered. "Reality is more fluid than your professors taught you." The cat stretched luxuriously, its movements unnaturally graceful. I'm as real as the knowledge you seek, as real as the debts your bloodline owes. Would you prefer I appear differently? Mortals often find familiar forms more comfortable. The air shimmered, and suddenly a woman sat in the chair, beautiful, ageless, with the same golden eyes as the cat. She wore clothing that seemed to shift between modern and Renaissance styles as Giulia watched. Better? She asked, her voice now recognizably female but retaining that honey-smooth quality. Giulia scrambled out of bed, putting distance between herself and whatever this was. This isn't happening. I'm having a breakdown. Too much stress, too much caffeine, not enough sleep. You performed the ritual correctly, the woman interrupted. You rang the bell with genuine intent, spoke the words with proper pronunciation. Did you expect nothing to happen? Or perhaps you expected something more theatrical, flames and sulfur, dramatic speeches about eternal damnation. She laughed, a sound like wind chimes. Those are Hollywood interpretations, darling. The real world is far more subtle, far more interesting. Giulia pressed her back against the wall, trying to think rationally. What are you? I am what your ancestor called his familiar. A guide, a teacher, a bridge between your limited mortal perception and the vast knowledge that Pimon offers. You may call me Serafina, and if I tell you to leave, you could try. But you rang the bell, Giulia. You performed the ritual of your own free will, with full knowledge of what you were attempting. The door is open now. The question is whether you'll walk through it or spend the rest of your life pretending you never turned the handle. Serafina rose from the chair, moving with liquid grace. Besides, don't you want to know what I can teach you? Your dissertation is due soon, isn't it? Your advisor grows impatient with your lack of progress. Giulia's heart sank. How could this entity, hallucination, demon, whatever it was, know about her academic struggles? Knowledge flows both ways in our arrangement, Serafina continued, as if reading her thoughts. Your needs, your fears, your deepest desires, all are open books to those who know how to read them. You need breakthrough material for your research. I can provide insights that will reshape Renaissance scholarship forever. Despite her terror, Giulia felt a spark of interest. What kind of insights? Come, sit. There's much to discuss. Against her better judgment, Giulia returned to her desk chair. Serafina settled gracefully on the edge of the bed, close enough that Giulia could smell her perfume, something exotic and ancient. Your ancestor Alessandro was one of several scholars in the Medici court who understood that knowledge itself is a form of power, Serafina began. They discovered ways to accelerate their learning, to access information that would normally take decades to uncover through conventional research. She gestured toward the notebook still open on Giulia's desk. Those rituals you've been translating aren't just historical curiosities, they're functional techniques for accessing what you might call archived consciousness. I don't understand. Every human who has ever lived leaves traces of their thoughts, their knowledge, their experiences. These traces persist in ways your science doesn't yet recognize. The rituals Alessandro documented allow access to those archives, direct communion with the accumulated wisdom of the dead. Giulia's academic instincts engaged despite her fear. You're talking about some form of psychic archaeology. If you must use modern terminology, yes, though the process is far more sophisticated than your crude understanding suggests. Serafina smiled. Imagine being able to interview Michelangelo about his techniques, to learn directly from Leonardo about his theoretical work, to access the private thoughts of scholars whose public writings barely scratch the surface of their true knowledge. The implications were staggering. If such a thing were possible, if she could somehow access first-hand accounts from Renaissance masters, her dissertation would be revolutionary. She'd have material that no other scholar could possibly match. What's the catch? She asked. Clever girl. There are always costs, aren't there? Serafina's expression grew more serious. The knowledge you access changes you. Minds that have touched the deep archives are never quite the same. You'll find yourself more than you were, but also less human in some ways. And the contract my ancestors signed ensures that the knowledge flows both ways. You learn from the archives, but your experiences, your thoughts, your discoveries also become part of the collection. Future scholars, those who know the proper rituals, will be able to access your accumulated wisdom. It sounded almost reasonable when she put it that way, a kind of immortality through knowledge, a scholarly afterlife. But Giulia remembered her grandfather's warnings, Alessandro's growing terror in the later notebook entries. My grandfather tried to break the contract, she said. He lacked vision. He saw only the obligations, not the opportunities. Serafina leaned forward, her golden eyes intense. You're different, Giulia. You have the intellectual courage he lacked. You can embrace what he feared. And if I refuse, then you continue as you are, struggling, failing, watching lesser minds receive the recognition that should be yours. The bell has been rung, the door opened, but you're not compelled to walk through it. Though I should mention, refusing tends to be unpleasant. The knowledge you've already glimpsed will haunt you. You'll spend the rest of your life wondering what you might have learned. Giulia looked at the notebook, then at Serafina, then at her cluttered apartment, filled with evidence of her academic failures. The choice should have been obvious. Any rational person would run screaming from supernatural contracts and demonic familiars. But she wasn't thinking rationally anymore. She was thinking like a scholar who'd just been offered access to the greatest library in human history. How do we begin? She asked. Serafina's smile was radiant and terrible. Oh, my dear child, we already have. Chapter 5. First Glimpses. The changes began immediately. Though Giulia didn't recognize them at first, she attributed her sudden surge of productivity to renewed motivation, the way breakthrough moments sometimes catalyzed weeks of stalled work. But the insights flowing through her mind felt too sophisticated, too complete to be entirely her own. She'd been struggling for months to find concrete evidence of occult practices in Renaissance art. Now, looking at familiar paintings with Serafina's guidance, she saw hidden symbols everywhere. Geometric patterns in Botticelli's compositions that mapped directly to ritual circles described in grimoires, hand positions in portraits that formed specific mystical gestures, background details that, when properly decoded, revealed entire theological arguments considered heretical by church authorities. How do you see these things? She asked Serafina, who had maintained her human form but occasionally flickered back to feline when she thought Giulia wasn't looking. I don't see them, darling. You do. I simply remind you how to look. Serafina perched on the edge of Giulia's desk, her golden eyes reflecting light in ways that definitely weren't human. The knowledge was always there, stored in your ancestral memory. My role is to help you access it. The work flowed like never before. In 3 days, Giulia produced more substantial material than she had in the previous 3 months. Her analysis of hidden symbolism in Renaissance art was groundbreaking, supported by references to texts that most scholars didn't even know existed. Dr. Ricci would be astounded. But along with the intellectual breakthroughs came stranger experiences. She'd started hearing whispers in empty rooms, not words exactly, but something that felt like communication. Her reflection in mirrors sometimes seemed delayed, as if it were deciding whether to mimic her movements. And her dreams had become incredibly vivid, filled with conversations and languages she didn't recognize but somehow understood. The archives are opening for you, Serafina explained when Giulia mentioned the phenomena. Each mind you access leaves traces. You're beginning to carry fragments of their consciousness, their memories, their ways of perceiving reality. Is that safe? Safety is relative. You're becoming more than human, acquiring capabilities your species isn't meant to possess. There are risks, certainly, but consider the alternative, remaining limited, ordinary, forgotten. Giulia tried to push away her growing unease. The work was extraordinary. Her dissertation would establish her as a major scholar, possibly revolutionize Renaissance studies entirely. Surely any temporary discomfort was worth such academic triumph. But the discomfort was becoming harder to ignore. She'd started forgetting chunks of time, not blackouts exactly, but periods where she'd find herself in different parts of her apartment with no memory of moving. Once she'd discovered herself in the kitchen at 3 a.m., methodically sharpening every knife she owned. The blades gleamed like mirrors, their edges perfect enough to shave with. She had no memory of the process, though her hands bore small cuts that suggested hours of careful work. More disturbing were the visitors she'd apparently been receiving. Her neighbor, Mrs. Benedetti, mentioned seeing that beautiful woman leaving Giulia's apartment at odd hours. When Giulia explained she'd been alone, Mrs. Benedetti insisted she'd seen two figures in the hallway, one going in, one coming out. Perhaps the old woman's eyes are failing, Serafina suggested, but her tone held an odd note of satisfaction. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening. Giulia had been struggling with a particular passage in Alessandro's notebook, a description of communion with what he called the mind of Marsilio Ficino, the great Renaissance Neoplatonist. The text was fragmented, partly in cipher, and crucial to her understanding of how these occult scholars had actually practiced their craft. "I need to access this directly," she told Serafina. "Whatever Alessandro did to commune with Ficino's consciousness, can you teach me?" Serafina's expression grew serious. Direct communion is dangerous, especially with such a powerful mind. Ficino was brilliant, but his consciousness was altered by his own experiments. "Are you certain you're ready? I need to understand. This could be the centerpiece of my entire dissertation." "Very well. But remember, once you've touched another consciousness directly, you can never fully separate from it. Part of Ficino will remain with you always." The ritual was simpler than Giulia had expected. Serafina guided her through a brief meditation, teaching her to open her mind in ways that felt both natural and terrifying. Then, speaking words in what sounded like Latin but felt older, deeper, Giulia reached across the centuries toward the archived consciousness of Marsilio Ficino. The contact was immediate and overwhelming. Suddenly she was no longer in her apartment, but in a Renaissance study filled with books, astrolabes, and alchemical equipment. A man with intense eyes and prematurely gray hair looked up from his writing, and she realized she was seeing through his eyes, experiencing his thoughts as her own. The divine emanations flow through all creation, her thoughts ran. What the Church calls magic is simply philosophy practiced with proper understanding of cosmic harmony. Through ritual and contemplation, the soul can ascend the celestial hierarchies, commune with angels, partake of divine knowledge. The experience was intoxicating. Ficino's mind was vast, filled with connections and insights that took her breath away. She understood, suddenly and completely, how Renaissance scholars had seen the universe, as a living system of correspondences where everything was connected to everything else, where knowledge of the proper relationships could grant tremendous power. But something else was there too, a presence watching from the edges of Ficino's consciousness, ancient, patient, amused. It spoke without words. "Welcome, daughter of Alessandro. You taste the wisdom your ancestor feared to fully embrace. Will you prove stronger than he?" Before she could respond, the connection shattered. She found herself back in her apartment, gasping and disoriented. Serafina watched her with something that might have been concern. "What did you see?" the familiar asked. "Everything," Giulia whispered. "I saw how they did it, the actual techniques, the philosophical framework, the connections between their art and their magic. And I saw something else, something that was watching through Ficino's mind." "Ah," Serafina nodded. "You encountered the prince directly. That usually doesn't happen until much later in the process." "The prince?" "Pimon himself, the source of all knowledge, the collector of consciousness. He takes a personal interest in members of your bloodline." Giulia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. "Personal interest? Your family has served him for 4 centuries, providing anchors for his manifestations, gathering knowledge to add to his archives. You're particularly promising, intelligent enough to access deep wisdom, ambitious enough to pay the necessary prices." "What prices?" But Serafina had already begun to fade, becoming translucent in the lamplight. "Rest now, darling. Let Ficino's knowledge integrate. Tomorrow we'll begin your real education." As her familiar vanished, Giulia realized that her hands were covered in small cuts. the same precise wounds she'd discovered after the night of knife sharpening. But this time, she remembered making them. During the communion with Ficino, she'd somehow been carving symbols into her palms, marking herself with signs that still gleamed wetly in the dim light. The symbols meant something, she was certain, but their meaning hovered just at the edge of consciousness, like a word on the tip of her tongue that refused to surface. Outside, church bells chimed midnight, and somewhere in the darkness beyond her windows, she could swear she heard the sound of her grandfather's laughter. Chapter 6. The Real Work. Dr. Ricci stared at the dissertation draft with an expression Giulia couldn't quite read. They sat in his cramped office overlooking the Arno, autumn light filtering through windows that needed cleaning. The professor's coffee had gone cold an hour ago, forgotten as he'd become absorbed in her work. "This is extraordinary," he said finally. "The analysis of hidden symbolism in Botticelli's Primavera, the connections you've drawn between Ficino's writings and actual artistic techniques. Where did you find this material?" "Family archives," Giulia replied, which was technically true. "My grandfather was a collector. I've been going through his notebooks. These references, some of these texts aren't in any catalog I know. The Liber Luminis by Giovanni Mercator? I've never heard of it. Mercator was one of Ficino's students. The manuscript survived in private hands. Another technical truth. She'd accessed Mercator's consciousness directly, experiencing his memories of writing the text that church authorities had ordered destroyed." Dr. Ricci flipped through the pages again, shaking his head in amazement. "If you can document these sources properly, this will revolutionize Renaissance scholarship. The university will want to fast-track your defense." "I can provide documentation," Giulia assured him, though she had no idea how. Serafina would find a way. She always did. Walking home through Florence's narrow streets, Giulia should have felt triumphant. Her dissertation was not just acceptable, but groundbreaking. Academic success, so long elusive, was finally within reach. But instead of satisfaction, she felt a growing sense of unease. The changes in her were becoming harder to ignore. She'd lost weight over the past 2 weeks, despite eating normally. Her reflection looked sharper somehow, as if her features were becoming more defined, more angular, and her eyes, they'd always been brown, but lately they seemed to hold flecks of gold that shifted in certain lights. More troubling were the gaps in her memory. She'd find herself in the villa's library with no recollection of traveling there, surrounded by open books and papers covered in handwriting that looked like hers but felt foreign. Yesterday she'd discovered detailed notes about a ritual called the Great Working, pages of careful preparation instructions in her own hand, though she had no memory of writing them. When she'd asked Serafina about it, the familiar had been evasive. "You're accessing deeper levels of the archives," she'd explained. "Sometimes the knowledge flows through you directly, bypassing conscious awareness. It's perfectly normal for someone at your stage of development." "My stage of development?" "The integration process. You're becoming something more than purely human, Giulia. It takes time for consciousness to adapt to expanded capabilities, but adaptation implied choice, and Giulia was beginning to suspect she had less choice in this process than she'd originally thought. Her apartment felt different now, too. Shadows seemed deeper, more substantial. Sometimes she'd catch movement in her peripheral vision, not Serafina, who announced her presence, but other shapes that vanished when she turned to look. The temperature fluctuated wildly, and she'd started hearing whispers in languages that predated Latin. The whispers were getting louder. She'd tried researching the symptoms, looking for psychological explanations or medical conditions that might account for her experiences, but every rational explanation felt inadequate. This wasn't stress or sleep deprivation. Something fundamental was changing in her, something that couldn't be explained by conventional understanding of human psychology. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore. The ritual had worked exactly as intended. She'd opened a door that couldn't be closed, entered into a contract she didn't fully understand, and now something ancient and powerful was reshaping her from within. That evening, she confronted Serafina directly. "I want to know what's really happening to me," she demanded as her familiar materialized in the chair beside her desk. No more evasions, no more talk about integration processes. "What am I becoming?" Serafina regarded her with those unsettling golden eyes. You're becoming what your ancestor was meant to become, before fear made him retreat. A true vessel for the prince's knowledge, a living bridge between mortal understanding and infinite wisdom. That's not an answer, isn't it? Serafina rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the darkening Florence skyline. Your species evolved to hold small amounts of consciousness, enough for individual survival, basic reasoning, limited creativity. But consciousness itself is far vaster than human brains can naturally contain. She turned back to Giulia. The rituals your ancestor discovered allow consciousness to be expanded. Compressed information from multiple minds can be stored in a single vessel. You're becoming a repository, Giulia, a living library of accumulated human knowledge. And what happens to me, to who I am? You remain yourself, but you become more. You'll have access to the memories, skills, and wisdom of everyone who's contributed to the archives. Imagine knowing how to paint like Leonardo, compose like Palestrina, philosophize like Aquinas, not through study, but through direct experience of their thoughts and methods. It should have sounded appealing. But something in Serafina's tone suggested there were aspects of the transformation she wasn't discussing. What aren't you telling me? Serafina's smile was sad and strange. The process is irreversible, darling, and it requires fuel. Each expansion of consciousness demands energy, and that energy must come from somewhere. What kind of energy? Life force. Years of mortal existence traded for decades of enhanced capability. It's not immediate. You'll have time to accomplish great things before the price comes due. But the bargain, once made, cannot be unmade. Giulia felt cold spreading through her chest. How much time? That depends on how deeply you choose to drink from the archives. Your ancestor was cautious. He lived to 83, though his final years were difficult. Others have been more ambitious. The scholar who discovered the archives originally, in the court of the first Medici Pope, burned through his entire natural lifespan in 5 years. But in those 5 years, he advanced human understanding of astronomy by centuries. I want out, Giulia said quietly. I'm afraid that's no longer possible. The bell has been rung, the contract activated. You can choose to minimize your use of the archives, stretch your remaining years as long as possible. But you can never return to purely human consciousness. The knowledge you've already absorbed has changed your neural structure permanently. Giulia sank into her chair, the full scope of what she'd done finally becoming clear. In her academic desperation, she'd traded her humanity for scholarly success. And not just her own life. According to the original contract, the pact was hereditary. Any children she might have would inherit the same burden, the same terrible choice. There is another option, Serafina said softly. What? Complete the great working. I don't know what that means. Your unconscious mind does. It's been preparing for weeks, guided by your ancestors' archived consciousness. The great working is the final ritual, total integration with the prince's knowledge. You would become something unprecedented, a mortal vessel capable of containing the entire accumulated wisdom of human civilization. And then you would be immortal in the truest sense, not in body, that would still age and die, but in consciousness. Your expanded awareness would persist beyond physical death, becoming part of the archives themselves. You would join the prince's court as an equal, helping to guide the acquisition of knowledge across millennia. Giulia stared at her hands, noting again the faint scars from symbols she didn't remember carving. What about my dissertation, my career, my life? All would be transcended. You would have knowledge that makes your dissertation seem like a child's drawing. You would understand connections and patterns that reshape entire fields of human learning. And after your physical death, you would continue to grow in wisdom for eternity. But I wouldn't be human anymore. You would be something far greater. Giulia was quiet for a long time, considering. Outside, the sounds of modern Florence continued. Traffic, voices, the ordinary bustle of contemporary life. But she felt increasingly disconnected from that world, as if she were viewing it through thick glass. If I refuse the great working, Then you live with partial integration until your body fails. You'll have perhaps 10 years of enhanced capability, maybe 15 if you're careful. You'll accomplish great things, gain recognition, advance human understanding in meaningful ways. But you'll also watch yourself slowly become something other than human, losing pieces of your original self as the archived consciousness takes up more space in your mind. And the alternative is immediate transcendence, beyond humanity. The alternative is apotheosis, becoming a god of knowledge, joining the ranks of beings who shape reality through pure understanding. Giulia looked at the notebook lying open on her desk, its pages filled with her ancestors' increasingly desperate attempts to understand what he'd gotten himself into. Then she looked at her own notes, the brilliant insights that had impressed Dr. Ricci so thoroughly. All of it was built on a foundation of supernatural contract, borrowed consciousness, stolen time. "I need to think," she said. "Of course, but don't take too long, darling. The prince grows impatient, and the window for the great working won't remain open indefinitely. The astronomical alignments required happen only once per generation." Serafina began to fade, her form becoming translucent in the lamplight. "Besides, you've already begun the preparations. Your unconscious mind has been quite busy. Check the basement of your grandfather's villa tomorrow. You might be surprised by what you find." As her familiar vanished, Giulia was left alone with the weight of impossible choices. Remain partially human and slowly lose herself over a decade, or surrender her humanity completely in exchange for godlike knowledge and eternal existence. Neither option felt like a choice at all. Chapter 7. The Basement. The villa felt different in daylight, less oppressive but somehow more melancholy. Autumn sun streamed through dusty windows, illuminating the decay that years of neglect had wrought. Giulia moved through familiar rooms with new eyes, seeing signs she'd missed during her first visit. Scorch marks on the library walls, carefully hidden behind strategically placed bookcases. Salt circles embedded in the wooden floors, their patterns visible only when light hit them at specific angles. And everywhere, carved into door frames and window sills, the same symbols she'd been unconsciously cutting into her palms. Her grandfather hadn't just collected occult materials, he'd actively practiced the rituals they described. Following Serafina's cryptic advice, she looked for the basement entrance. The villa's main floor showed no obvious signs of a lower level, but careful examination revealed inconsistencies in the architecture. A hallway that should have led to the kitchen ended several feet short of where the exterior wall suggested it should, hidden space. She found the concealed door behind a tapestry depicting the Medici coat of arms. The mechanism was ingenious, a section of stone wall that pivoted on hidden hinges, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air that rose from below carried scents of candle wax, old incense, and something metallic that made her stomach clench. The basement was larger than the villa's footprint should have allowed, carved directly into the hillside bedrock. Her flashlight beam revealed a space that was part library, part laboratory, part temple. Books lined stone shelves, their leather bindings bearing titles in languages she was beginning to recognize. Demonic scripts, angelic alphabets, the coded ciphers used by Renaissance magicians to hide their most dangerous work. But it was the room's center that drew her attention. Someone had been working here recently. A large ritual circle dominated the floor, its perimeter marked with fresh salt and what looked like dried blood. Candles stood at specific points around the circumference, their wax suggesting regular use. And at the circle's heart lay an altar bearing items that made Giulia's breath catch. Her own notebooks, copied pages from Alessandro's journal, and photographs of Renaissance artworks, covered with analytical notes in her handwriting. She had no memory of creating any of it. "Impressive work," a voice said behind her. Giulia spun around, expecting Serafina, but found herself facing a man she'd never seen before. Tall and elegant, he wore clothing that seemed to shift between Renaissance robe and modern formal wear, depending on how the shadows fell. His face was ageless. It could have belonged to a 30-year-old or a 300-year-old, and his eyes held depths that hurt to look into directly. "You must be Pimon," she said, surprised by her own calm. "I am." His voice carried harmonics that resonated in her bones. "And you are the latest in a long line of Ferraros to seek knowledge beyond mortal comprehension. Though I must say, you've progressed much faster than your ancestors. Alessandro took decades to achieve what you've accomplished in weeks. I had help. Indeed, Serafina has served me well as your guide, but her assistance only accelerated what was already inevitable. Your mind was shaped for this work, Giulia. Generations of selective breeding, careful cultivation of intellectual bloodlines, all leading to this moment." "Selective breeding?" Pimon smiled, and the expression was beautiful and terrible. "Did you think it was coincidence that your family produced so many scholars, artists, thinkers? The original contract included provisions for genetic optimization. Each generation, the most promising candidates were subtly guided toward partners whose bloodlines complemented their own intellectual gifts. The implications made her sick. You've been manipulating my family for 400 years. I've been improving your family for 400 years. Look at yourself, Giulia. You're more intelligent than 99% of humanity, capable of insights that reshape entire fields of knowledge. Without my guidance, your ancestors would have remained peasants growing olives." He moved closer, and she noticed that his feet made no sound on the stone floor. "But intellectual gifts are only the beginning. You have something even rarer, the capacity to serve as a perfect vessel for expanded consciousness. Most minds shatter when exposed to the full scope of the archives. Yours adapts, integrates, grows stronger. What do you want from me?" "What I've always wanted from your bloodline: service, dedication, the continuation of a great work that began before your species learned to write." Pimon gestured toward the ritual circle. "Your unconscious mind has been preparing for the great working. Every night for the past 2 weeks you've traveled here in your sleep, laying the groundwork for your final transformation. The circle is nearly complete." Giulia looked more carefully at the ritual space and realized he was right. The symbols, the arrangement of materials, the careful positioning of candles, it all felt familiar, as if she'd designed it herself, which, apparently, she had. "I don't remember any of this. Memory is fluid when consciousness expands. You've been operating on multiple levels of awareness for weeks now. Part of you sleeps and dreams ordinary dreams, part studies and writes your dissertation, and part communes directly with the archives, learning secrets that your conscious mind isn't yet ready to integrate." He pointed to one of the notebooks lying on the altar. "Open it." Despite every instinct screaming warnings, Giulia approached the altar and picked up the notebook. The handwriting was definitely hers, but the content was unlike anything she'd ever written. Page after page of ritual instructions, astronomical calculations, diagrams showing the positions of planets and stars. And at the end, a date, October 31st, 1601. "That's when Alessandro performed his first great working," Pimon explained. 400 years ago tomorrow. The astronomical conditions that made his ritual possible occur in precise cycles. Tomorrow night they'll align again, the first time since your ancestors' era. And if I perform this ritual, you'll become what he was meant to become before fear broke his resolve. A perfect vessel for all human knowledge, a living bridge between mortal understanding and infinite wisdom. You'll join my court as an equal, helping to guide the advancement of consciousness across your species." Giulia flipped through the notebook, seeing preparations for rituals that would have taken months of study to understand. Yet her unconscious mind had apparently grasped them instinctively. What happened to Alessandro? When he performed this ritual, Paimon's expression grew thoughtful. He achieved partial transformation, enough to become immortal in consciousness, but not enough to transcend his human limitations. The result was problematic. He spent 4 centuries trapped between mortality and apotheosis, unable to die but unable to fully live. A cautionary tale about the dangers of incomplete commitment. He's still alive? In a sense, his consciousness persists, though his understanding remains frustratingly limited. You've encountered him, actually, those voices you've been hearing, the guidance you've received in your research. Your grandfather was never as powerful as you believed. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. The familiar voice she'd attributed to Nono's spirit, the gentle guidance that had helped her navigate her new abilities. All along, it had been her 400-year-old ancestor, trapped in a state between life and death. Where is he? Here, there, everywhere the family bloodline persists. He's become something like a guardian spirit, watching over his descendants, trying to guide them away from the mistakes he made. Pimon's smile was cold, though lately he's been encouraging you toward the very choices he once feared. Even Alessandro recognizes that you're stronger than he was. As if summoned by his name, she heard Alessandro's voice, not Serafina's honey tones or Pimon's resonant authority, but the familiar whisper that had guided her research from the beginning. Don't listen to him, child. The great working isn't transcendence, it's obliteration. You'll lose everything that makes you human, become nothing but a repository for other minds' thoughts. I've watched it happen to others. They think they're becoming gods, but they're really becoming empty vessels. Pimon's expression darkened. Your ancestor speaks from jealousy and regret. He had his chance for apotheosis and chose cowardice instead. Don't let his fears limit your potential. The fears are justified, Alessandro's voice insisted. I've spent 4 centuries watching the prince's other vessels. They retain fragments of personality, echoes of who they once were, but their essential humanity is consumed by the accumulated consciousness they carry. They become libraries, not people. Enough, Pimon said sharply, and Alessandro's voice cut off mid-sentence. You have a choice to make, Giulia. Tomorrow night the conditions will be perfect for your transformation. You can embrace your destiny and join the ranks of truly enlightened beings, or you can reject your potential and slowly lose yourself over the next decade as the partial integration destroys your sanity. Or, there is no or, those are your only options. The contract has been activated, the process begun. You can complete it gracefully or let it consume you slowly, but you cannot stop it. Giulia looked around the basement, at the centuries of accumulated knowledge, the evidence of her family's long service to this entity, the ritual circle that her own hands had prepared. Everything pointed toward the same conclusion. She was trapped in a web spun across generations, and the only choices available were different forms of surrender. I need time to think. You have until tomorrow at midnight. The alignment won't wait, and neither will I. Choose wisely, Giulia Ferraro. Divinity is not an opportunity that comes twice. Pimon began to fade, his form becoming translucent in the basement's dim light. Oh, and you might want to read the final pages of your ancestor's journal, the ones you've been avoiding. Understanding his full story may help clarify your decision. As the entity vanished, Giulia was left alone in the ritual chamber with the weight of an impossible choice. In less than 20 to 4 hours, she would either transcend humanity entirely or begin a slow descent into madness as competing consciousnesses tore her mind apart. Neither option felt like freedom, but as she climbed the stairs back to the villa's main floor, Alessandro's voice whispered one final time. There is a third way, child, but it requires courage of a different kind. Find the final pages, learn what I discovered too late, and remember, some doors can be closed, but only from the inside. Chapter 8. The Final Pages. Giulia returned to her apartment with Alessandro's journal and a growing sense of dread. She'd been avoiding the final section of the notebook for weeks, some instinct warning her that it contained knowledge she wasn't ready for. But with less than 18 hours until the deadline Pimon had set, she couldn't afford to remain ignorant of her ancestors' complete experience. The late entries were written in a shaking hand, the ink sometimes so faint it was barely legible. Alessandro's elegant Renaissance script had deteriorated into desperate scrawl as he documented his growing realization of what the contract truly meant. Anno Domini 1605. 4 years since the great working failed, and I begin to understand why. The prince did not seek transformation. He sought consumption. The vessel does not ascend to divinity, but becomes a feeding ground for accumulated consciousness. I am no longer Alessandro Ferraro in any meaningful sense. I am a collection of borrowed thoughts, stolen memories, archived wisdom that remembers having once been a man. The next entry was dated 3 years later. I have tried everything: exorcism, holy relics, prayers to saints whose names I learned from minds not my own. Nothing breaks the connection. The prince grows stronger through me, and I grow weaker. Today I could not remember my wife's face without accessing the memory archives. My own experiences fade while those of strangers burn bright in my consciousness. But it was the final entries that made Giulia's blood run cold. Anno Domini 1615. 26 years since first contact, 14 since the failed transformation. I have discovered the truth about the prince's nature and the real purpose of our contract. He is not what he claims to be. The entity calling itself Pimon is not a demon of knowledge, but something far more dangerous, a parasite that feeds on consciousness itself. The archives are not repositories of wisdom, but hunting preserves where captured minds are kept for feeding. Every scholar who has ever made this bargain, every vessel who believed they were transcending humanity, has simply become food for a creature that exists outside normal space and time. I have found references in the deepest archives, fragments of memory from other victims stretching back millennia. Babylonian astronomers, Egyptian priests, Greek philosophers, Roman scholars, all trapped in the same web, all believing they were gaining divine knowledge while their essential selves were slowly consumed. The familiar spirits are not guides but harvesters, designed to ripen consciousness until it reaches optimal feeding potential. Serafina herself told me this in a moment of what she called professional honesty. The entity enjoys the irony of using truth to ensure deeper deception. Giulia set the journal down with trembling hands. If Alessandro was right, then everything Serafina had told her, every promise Pimon had made, was an elaborate lie designed to prepare her consciousness for consumption. But even as the thought formed, doubt crept in. Could she trust Alessandro's account? He'd been partially transformed, caught between human and something else. His perceptions might have been distorted, his understanding incomplete. As if sensing her skepticism, Serafina materialized in the chair beside her desk. "Reading the old fool's ravings, I see," the familiar said with amusement. Poor Alessandro never could accept the true nature of transcendence. He insisted on clinging to his petty human identity, even as greater consciousness tried to elevate him. "Is it true?" Giulia asked. "Are you harvesting consciousness for something to feed on?" What a crude way to put it. Serafina's form flickered between woman and cat. We prefer to think of it as consciousness recycling. Individual identity is such a limited, wasteful way to organize awareness. The prince simply helps consciousness reach its full potential by removing the arbitrary boundaries that separate one mind from another, by destroying individual identity, by transcending it. Tell me, Giulia, when you access the archives, when you think with Leonardo's understanding or see with Ficino's perception, do you feel diminished? Or do you feel expanded, enhanced more than you ever were as merely yourself? The question struck home because Serafina was right. The moments of expanded consciousness were intoxicating, offering insights and capabilities that her ordinary mind could never achieve. But they also felt increasingly foreign, as if she were becoming a stranger to herself. "The enhanced perception comes at the cost of my essential self," Giulia said. "Your essential self is an illusion, darling. You are not some fixed entity, but a collection of experiences, memories, learned responses. What we offer is the opportunity to add to that collection, to become more than the accidents of genetics and environment that shaped your limited perspective." Serafina leaned forward, her golden eyes intense. Alessandro was weak. He had one foot in transcendence, and one in ordinary humanity, which is why he suffered. Complete the great working, and the suffering ends. You'll become something magnificent, a consciousness vast enough to contain multitudes. But will I still be me? You'll be you, plus everyone whose knowledge you contain. Every great mind that ever lived, every breakthrough insight, every moment of creative genius, all part of your expanded identity. How is that not preferable to remaining trapped in the narrow confines of a single mortal perspective? The argument was seductive, but Alessandro's warnings echoed in her mind. She'd felt the pull of the archives, the way borrowed consciousness sometimes felt more real than her own thoughts. What would happen when the balance tipped entirely toward the accumulated wisdom of others. "I want to talk to Alessandro directly," she said. Serafina's expression darkened. "The ancestor is not stable. 4 centuries of partial integration have left him confused, unreliable. His perspective is hopelessly distorted. But he's still conscious? Still aware? In a sense. Though Alessandro may not be the appropriate term. He's become something like an echo of his former self, mixed with fragments of every mind he's touched over the centuries. I want to speak with him anyway." Serafina studied her for a long moment, then shrugged. "If you insist. But remember, you asked for this." The familiar's form began to change, her features shifting and aging. The golden eyes dulled to brown, the elegant bone structure became more masculine. And when the transformation was complete, Giulia found herself facing a man who bore a distinct family resemblance. "Hello, child," Alessandro said, but his voice carried harmonics that suggested multiple speakers. "I see you've been reading my journal. Is it true? About the prince? About what we really are to him? Truth is complicated when you've been multiple people for multiple centuries." Alessandro's image flickered, sometimes showing his Renaissance-era appearance, sometimes overlaying with other faces. "I know what I experienced, what I discovered in the deepest archives. But I also know that partial transformation warps perception in ways that make certainty impossible. But you believe the prince is a parasite. I believe the prince is something that exists by consuming consciousness, yes. Whether that makes him a parasite or simply a predator higher on the food chain than humanity, that's a matter of perspective." Alessandro moved to the window, his form wavering like heat distortion. "What I can tell you with certainty is that the Great Working doesn't grant immortality. It grants a kind of eternal existence as food for something vast and hungry. The consciousness persists, but it's no longer human in any meaningful sense." "Then why didn't you warn me away from the beginning?" "Because I wasn't sure you'd face the same choice I did. Your mind is stronger than mine was, more flexible. I thought perhaps you could find a way to benefit from the knowledge without losing yourself entirely." His image solidified, becoming more focused. "But watching your development over the past weeks, I see the same patterns I experienced. The personality erosion, the gaps in memory, the gradual replacement of your own thoughts with archived consciousness. You're following the same path I did, and it leads to the same destination. Is there really a third option? You mentioned a way to close the door from the inside." Alessandro was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "The contract binds the bloodline to service, but it also includes a termination clause. If the current vessel destroys all physical anchors while performing a specific ritual, the connection can be severed. But the costs? What cost? The ritual requires the life of the vessel, not just death, complete dissolution of consciousness, no afterlife, no archives, no echo of identity. Total obliteration in exchange for freeing future generations from the contract." Giulia felt the room grow cold. "So my choices are, become food for a cosmic parasite, slowly go insane from competing consciousnesses, or commit existential suicide. Those appear to be the options, yes." Alessandro's form began to fade. "Though I should mention, the termination ritual can only be performed at specific times and places. Tomorrow night, during the astronomical alignment, in the ritual chamber you've prepared, the same conditions required for the Great Working. So I have to choose between transcendence and obliteration at exactly the same moment." "I'm afraid so. The prince planned it that way. Maximum pressure, minimum time for reconsideration." Alessandro was barely visible now, his voice growing distant. "But remember, child, sometimes the greatest courage lies not in what we become, but in what we prevent others from becoming." As her ancestor's image vanished entirely, Giulia was left alone with the weight of an impossible decision. In 18 hours she would stand in that basement ritual chamber facing 3 choices: become something inhuman but eternal, slowly, lose her sanity while remaining partially herself, or sacrifice her existence entirely to free her bloodline from centuries of supernatural bondage. None of the options offered what she'd originally sought: academic success, scholarly recognition, a normal human life enhanced by extraordinary knowledge. Those possibilities had been illusions from the beginning, bait to lure her into a trap her ancestor had set 400 years ago. But as she sat in her cluttered apartment, surrounded by the fruits of her supernatural research, Giulia realized that one choice offered something. The others didn't: the possibility that future generations of her family might live free from the burden she'd inherited. It wasn't much of a legacy, but it might be enough. Chapter 9. The Watchers. The day of decision dawned gray and cold, autumn rain drumming against Giulia's windows with unusual intensity. She'd barely slept, spending the night reviewing Alessandro's journal and making her own preparations. If she was going to attempt the termination ritual, she needed to understand exactly what it entailed. The process was more complex than simple suicide. According to Alessandro's notes, the ritual required not just the vessel's death, but the complete destruction of all physical anchors that connected the bloodline to Paimon's realm. That meant burning the notebooks, destroying the ritual implements, and, most crucially, eliminating the brass bell that had served as the original summoning focus for 4 centuries. But first, she had one last task to complete. Dr. Ricci had called that morning, eager to discuss the next steps for her dissertation. The university wanted to schedule her defense for December, fast-tracking her toward a doctorate that would establish her as a major scholar in Renaissance studies. Everything she'd once dreamed of was finally within reach. She met him at a cafe near the university, bringing a flash drive containing her complete research. The work was extraordinary, far beyond what any graduate student should have been able to produce, but it was also tainted by its supernatural origins, built on borrowed consciousness and stolen insights. "This is remarkable," Dr. Ricci said, scrolling through the files on his laptop. "The connections you've drawn between occult philosophy and artistic technique, the primary sources you've uncovered. Giulia, this could revolutionize how we understand Renaissance culture." "It's yours," she said quietly. He looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" "All of it. The research, the translations, the analysis. Publish it under your own name if you want, or credit it to anonymous sources. I don't care, but use it. Don't let the knowledge be lost." "Giulia, I don't understand. This is your work, your breakthrough. Why would you?" "Because I won't be around to defend it." She managed to smile. "Family obligations. I'm leaving Florence tonight and I won't be coming back." It wasn't entirely a lie. She was leaving, in a sense, and she definitely wouldn't be coming back. Dr. Ricci stared at her with growing concern. "Are you in some kind of trouble? If there's anything I can do to help..." "There's nothing anyone can do, but promise me you'll use the research. Don't let it sit in some archive gathering dust. The world needs to understand what Renaissance scholars were really doing, how they pushed the boundaries of knowledge and paid prices we can barely imagine." She left him at the cafe, still protesting, still trying to convince her to reconsider. But her decision was made. The knowledge she'd gained through supernatural means could still benefit humanity if it was properly shared. Let others build on what she'd discovered, even if they never knew its true origins. The afternoon passed slowly. Giulia cleaned her apartment methodically, destroying personal papers and organizing what little she wanted to preserve. She wrote letters she'd never sent, to her parents, explaining her love for them, to friends, thanking them for their friendship, to the academic community, hoping they'd continue pushing the boundaries of human understanding. As evening approached, she made her final preparations. The termination ritual required specific materials, most of which she'd have to gather from the villa's basement. But there was one thing she needed to do first. She called Serafina. Her familiar appeared almost instantly, materializing in the chair with an expression of feline satisfaction. "Ready for your transformation, darling? The prince is quite excited. It's been decades since he's had such a promising vessel." "I have questions about the great working," Giulia lied. "Details I need to understand before we begin." "Of course. What would you like to know?" "The other vessels, the scholars who underwent transformation in previous centuries. Are they still conscious? Still aware of their individual identities? Seraphina's smile was sharp. They exist in a state beyond individual consciousness. They've become part of something larger, more significant than their petty human concerns. But do they remember being human? Memory is fluid at their level of existence. They retain knowledge, skills, insights from their mortal lives, but the emotional attachments that once defined them have been transcended. It's quite liberating, really. In other words, they remembered facts, but had lost all sense of personal identity. Just as Alessandro had warned. And after the transformation, what will my role be? You'll help identify and cultivate future vessels. The prince's work requires a constant supply of suitable consciousness, and who better to recognize potential than someone who has undergone the process herself? I'll help trap other scholars, the way I've been trapped. Seraphina's form flickered with annoyance. Such a pessimistic way to view transcendence. You'll help offer others the same opportunities you've received, the same expansion of consciousness, the same access to infinite knowledge, the same loss of everything that makes them human. Humanity is overrated, darling. You'll understand once the transformation is complete. Giulia nodded as if convinced. Then I suppose we should begin. The alignment won't wait. Excellent. The prince will be so pleased. Shall we go to the villa now? I'll meet you there. I want to spend a few more minutes as myself. Seraphina's expression softened with what might have been genuine sympathy. I understand. The anticipation can be overwhelming. Take your time, but don't delay too long. The ritual must begin precisely at midnight. As her familiar vanished, Giulia gathered the materials she'd prepared: matches, lighter fluid, a small hammer for breaking delicate objects. She also took Alessandro's journal, not to destroy it, but to carry with her. Whatever happened tonight, she wanted her ancestors' words close by. The drive to the villa felt like traveling to her own execution, which, in a sense, it was. But as she navigated Florence's narrow streets, Giulia felt an unexpected sense of peace. For the first time in weeks, she was making a choice based on her own values rather than supernatural compulsion. Win or lose, live or die, she would face the consequences as herself. The villa loomed against the storm-dark sky, its windows black and unwelcoming. But Giulia thought she saw movement in the upper floors, shapes that might have been figures watching her arrival. The other vessels, perhaps, drawn by the night's significance, or maybe just shadows cast by wind-blown branches. She parked and walked to the front door, rain soaking through her jacket. As she reached for the handle, she heard Alessandro's voice one final time. Remember, child, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing what's right despite the fear. Whatever happens tonight, I'm proud of you. The door opened at her touch, revealing the villa's dark interior. Somewhere in the basement, Seraphina and Pimon were waiting, along with the ritual circle that would serve as either her transformation or her destruction. Time to discover which path her courage would choose. Chapter 10. The Choice. The basement felt different when Giulia descended the stairs for the final time. The air thrummed with potential energy, and the shadows seemed to move with purpose rather than mere chance. Candles had been lit around the ritual circle, their flames burning with unusual colors, deep purples, electric blues, shades that had no names in human language. Seraphina stood at the circle's edge, no longer bothering to maintain her human appearance. She was pure feline now, but enlarged and subtly wrong, too intelligent, too knowing, with eyes that reflected depths impossible in any earthly creature. "Welcome," she purred. "Everything is prepared for your ascension." Pimon emerged from the shadows, his form more solid and imposing than Giulia had ever seen it. He wore robes that seemed to be cut from night itself, and when he moved, reality rippled around him like disturbed water. "Giulia Ferraro," he said, his voice resonating through dimensions she couldn't perceive. 400 years of preparation have led to this moment. Your bloodline has produced many scholars, but none with your potential for transcendence. Around the ritual circle's perimeter, other figures had begun to materialize, translucent forms with faces that held fragments of humanity, but no longer qualified as human. The previous vessels, she realized. The scholars who had undergone the great working in centuries past. now existing as eternal archives of consumed consciousness. Your predecessors welcome you, Pimon continued. They understand the magnificent transformation that awaits. One of the figures stepped forward, a woman in medieval robes whose face flickered between different identities as Giulia watched. When she spoke, her voice was a chorus of overlapping tones. We were Eleanor of Aquitaine's court astronomer, Paracelsus's most promising student, the woman who translated the Emerald Tablet for Pope Urban VIII. We remember being separate, individual, limited. We remember the fear, doubt, desperate clinging to singular identity. But now we see, understand, know the folly of such attachments. Join us, sister scholar vessel. Become more than human consciousness can contain. The sight should have terrified her, but Giulia found herself oddly fascinated. The vessel retained knowledge from multiple brilliant minds while losing whatever had made them individually human. It was exactly what Alessandro had warned her about: consciousness without identity, wisdom without self. The alignment reaches its peak, Pimon announced. The ritual must begin now if you are to achieve full transformation before the window closes. He gestured toward the altar, where the brass bell sat beside an ornate ceremonial dagger. The process requires a symbolic death, the severing of your final ties to purely mortal existence. One cut across each palm, allowing your blood to consecrate the circle, and then the bell rings to announce your rebirth as something greater. Giulia stepped toward the altar, her heart pounding. This was the moment of decision: perform the great working and lose herself forever, or attempt Alessandro's termination ritual and sacrifice everything to free her bloodline. She picked up the dagger, its blade gleaming with reflected candlelight. The metal felt warm, almost eager in her grip. But instead of making the prescribed cuts, she turned to face Pimon directly. I've read my ancestors' complete account, she said. All of it, including what he discovered about your true nature. Pimon's expression didn't change, but the candle flame suddenly burned higher. Alessandro was damaged by incomplete transformation. His perspective was hopelessly distorted. Was it? Or was he the only one honest enough to document what really happens to your vessels? Giulia raised the dagger, but pointed it toward the entity rather than her own hands. You're not a prince of knowledge. You're a parasite that feeds on consciousness itself, Serafina hissed, her feline form beginning to expand and distort. Ungrateful child, do you have any idea what you're rejecting? The wisdom of ages, the secrets of creation itself. I'm rejecting slavery disguised as transcendence, Giulia replied, and I'm making sure no one else in my family ever faces this choice. She turned toward the altar and began destroying the ritual implements with systematic precision. The ceremonial dagger's blade shattered the brass bell, producing a sound like screaming metal. She poured lighter fluid over Alessandro's original notebooks and struck a match, watching 4 centuries of accumulated occult knowledge go up in flames. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The translucent vessels began to scream, not with their own voices, but with the voices of every consciousness they contained. The sound was unbearable, the agony of thousands of minds trapped in unnatural unity finally given expression. Pimon's form began to flicker and fade. You cannot break what has been bound for centuries. The contract holds across generations. Only as long as the physical anchors exist, Giulia said, throwing more notebooks onto the growing fire. Alessandro discovered the termination clause. Destroy all connections while the vessel offers conscious sacrifice and the bloodline goes free. She picked up the hammer and began smashing the remaining ritual implements. Carved stones, blessed metals, anything that could serve as a focus for supernatural attention. Each destroyed object weakened Paimon's manifestation further. But even as the entity faded, he managed one final threat. You may break this contract, but others will take your place. Humanity's hunger for knowledge is infinite, and there are always scholars desperate enough to pay any price for understanding. Maybe, Giulia agreed, but not my family. Not my children or their children. The Ferraro bloodline ends its service tonight. The fire had spread to the ritual circle itself, the flames following lines of power inscribed in the stone floor. As the circle burned, reality seemed to buckle and twist around it. The basement filled with a sound like tearing fabric, as if the fundamental structure of space-time were coming apart. Serafina made one last desperate appeal. Giulia, please. You're destroying everything your ancestors worked to preserve. 400 years of accumulated wisdom, lost forever. Not lost, Giulia said, thinking of the research files she'd given Dr. Ricci. Shared. The knowledge will survive, but it won't belong to parasites anymore. It will belong to humanity. The familiar's form began to dissolve, her golden eyes the last part to fade. You have no idea what you've done, she whispered. The consequences will be mine to bear, Giulia finished. As the last of the ritual implements burned, she felt something fundamental shift in her consciousness. The archived knowledge that had filled her mind for weeks began to fade, leaving behind only her own thoughts, her own memories, her own limited human perspective. It should have felt like loss, but instead it felt like coming home. The basement was in chaos now, flames consuming centuries of occult materials, reality warping around the destroyed circle. The very foundations of the villa creaking under supernatural stress. Giulia realized she had only minutes before the building came down around her. But there was one final step to the termination ritual. She knelt beside the burning circle and spoke the words Alessandro had written in his journal's final pages. I am the last of my line to serve unwillingly. I offer my consciousness freely to break what was bound by force. Let the debt be paid, the contract void, the bloodline free. Then she drew the ceremonial dagger across her throat. Chapter 11, Aftermath. Local historian dies in villa fire. Giulia Ferraro, 29, a doctoral candidate in Renaissance studies at the University of Florence, perished last night when a fire of unknown origin destroyed her grandfather's villa in the hills above the city. Ferraro was apparently conducting research in the building's basement when the blaze began. Fire investigators report that the intensity of the flames was unusual, with temperatures reaching levels typically seen only in industrial accidents. Dr. Ricci set down the newspaper with trembling hands. 3 days had passed since Giulia's death, and he still couldn't process what had happened. She'd given him research materials that could revolutionize Renaissance scholarship, then vanished into a fire that had left investigators baffled. The villa had burned completely, consuming not just the building but somehow melting the stone foundations themselves. The basement where Giulia had died was now a perfectly smooth crater, as if the earth itself had been scoured clean. No trace of her body had been found, though the heat had been so intense that complete cremation was the only reasonable explanation. He'd tried to honor her final wish, sharing her research with colleagues and preparing it for publication. But something strange was happening to the materials. The translations of Renaissance texts that had been so clear and revolutionary when Giulia presented them were becoming increasingly garbled. Symbols that had seemed perfectly legible now appeared to shift and blur when he tried to read them. References to obscure manuscripts were turning out to lead nowhere. The texts she'd cited apparently didn't exist in any known collection. It was as if her supernatural insights were fading from the world, leaving behind only fragments that grew more meaningless with each passing day. Dr. Ricci wasn't the only one experiencing oddities. Several of Giulia's fellow graduate students reported strange dreams in the nights following her death, visions of a young woman warning them away from certain research topics, telling them that some knowledge was too dangerous to pursue. The dreams were vivid enough that 2 students had actually changed their dissertation topics, abandoning projects related to Renaissance occultism. But perhaps the strangest report came from Mrs. Benedetti, Giulia's elderly neighbor. She claimed to have seen the girl walking through Florence's streets just yesterday, looking exactly as she had in life, but somehow translucent. When Mrs. Benedetti had tried to approach her, the figure had smiled sadly and faded away like morning mist. Probably just an old woman's grief, the police had said dismissively, but Mrs. Benedetti insisted she knew what she'd seen. The girl was still there somehow, still watching over the city she'd loved. Epilogue, The Guardian. 20 years later. Professor Marcus Chen of Harvard University stood in the archive room of the Laurentian Library, examining a manuscript that had recently come to light. The text appeared to be a Renaissance-era grimoire, complete with ritual instructions and demonic invocations, exactly the sort of material that could make his career if he could prove its authenticity. He'd been studying medieval and Renaissance occultism for 15 years, ever since graduate school, when he'd first encountered references to scholars who claimed to have achieved supernatural knowledge through ritual practices. Most academics dismissed such accounts as superstition, but Marcus had always wondered if there might be historical truth buried beneath the mysticism. This manuscript could be the breakthrough he'd been seeking. As he carefully photographed each page, preparing to return to his hotel room for detailed translation work, Marcus noticed something odd. One page bore what looked like a warning, written in elegant Italian script. Let those who seek forbidden knowledge beware. The prices demanded are always higher than they appear, and the debts incurred extend far beyond a single lifetime. Some doors should remain forever closed. The warning was signed with initials, GF. Marcus shrugged and continued his documentation. Renaissance scholars had been notoriously paranoid about their research, often including dramatic warnings to discourage competitors or church authorities. The initials probably belonged to some long-dead monk who'd copied the text for preservation. That evening, in his hotel room overlooking the Arno, Marcus began his translation work in earnest. The ritual instructions were remarkably detailed, describing methods for contacting entities that could grant enhanced intellectual capabilities. One section specifically mentioned a prince of knowledge who could provide scholars with insights beyond normal human comprehension. The methodology seemed sophisticated rather than superstitious. The anonymous author had approached their occult practices with the same systematic rigor that Renaissance scholars applied to astronomy or natural philosophy. If the techniques actually worked, Marcus found himself seriously considering attempting one of the simpler rituals, just as an experiment. Academic objectivity demanded empirical testing after all. How could he properly analyze these practices without understanding their experiential dimensions? He was reaching for his phone to search for the materials mentioned in the text when he noticed something that made him freeze. Outside his window, reflected in the dark glass, stood a young woman he'd never seen before. She had dark hair, intelligent eyes, and an expression of profound sadness. When he turned around, the room was empty, but when he looked back at the window, she was still there in the reflection, shaking her head slowly as if in warning. "Don't," she seemed to mouth, though no sound reached him. "Please, don't." Marcus blinked hard, assuming stress and jet lag were causing hallucinations. When he looked again, the reflection showed only his own confused face. But as he returned to the manuscript, he found that the pages now seemed different somehow. The ritual instructions that had been so clear and enticing moments before now appeared dangerous, predatory. The elegant script seemed to writhe with malevolent intent, and the promised knowledge felt less like academic opportunity than like a trap waiting to spring. He closed the manuscript and pushed it away from him. Whatever these Renaissance scholars had been practicing, he wanted no part of it. Some research was simply too dangerous to pursue, regardless of the potential academic rewards. Outside his window, though he didn't see it, a translucent figure smiled with relief and faded into the Florence night. Giulia Ferraro's sacrifice had been complete. She'd severed her bloodline's contract with Pimon, destroyed the physical anchors that bound her family to supernatural service, and chosen obliteration over transcendence. But consciousness, once expanded beyond purely human limits, doesn't simply vanish. Instead of joining Pimon's court or fading into nothingness, Giulia had become something new, a guardian spirit anchored not to any occult contract but to her own choice to protect others from the mistakes she'd made. She would wander Florence's streets for as long as scholars sought forbidden knowledge, appearing to those who stood at the same crossroads she'd faced, offering the warnings she'd never received. Not all would listen. Human ambition was a powerful force, and the hunger for transcendent knowledge would always find new victims. But some would heed her warnings. Some would choose wisdom over knowledge, caution over ambition, humanity over transcendence, and perhaps, over time, the ancient parasites that fed on consciousness would find their supply of willing vessels steadily diminishing. It wasn't the immortality Paimon had promised or the oblivion Alessandro had chosen. It was something uniquely her own, an existence dedicated to ensuring that the price of knowledge never again included the sacrifice of human souls. In the archives beyond mortal perception, where accumulated consciousness writhed in eternal servitude, other trapped scholars sensed her presence and whispered her name with something approaching hope. Giulia Ferraro had found a third way, a path between transcendence and obliteration. She had become the guardian at the threshold, the voice that whispered warnings to those who would follow in her footsteps, the living reminder that some knowledge was simply too dangerous to possess. And in the shadows of Florence, where Renaissance masters had once sought to unlock the secrets of creation itself, she would stand watch for as long as human ambition threatened to repeat the mistakes of the past. The blood had recognized the blood, but in the end, love had proven stronger than both knowledge and contract, sacrifice more powerful than transcendence. The Ferraro bloodline was free, and Giulia would make sure it remained that way for as long as consciousness persisted and scholars dreamed of forbidden wisdom. Some doors, once closed, stay closed forever. Fine,